Daniel Biss. I'm running for mayor of Evanston. This is our public safety community conversation. And we're just allowing a couple more people in from the waiting room, but I'm thrilled at the attendance of folks already here and want to make sure we start quickly out of respect for everyone's time. So sit tight for just a brief moment and we'll get moving. Okay, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I want to start with a few housekeeping items. First of all, for anyone in need of this, we have sign language interpretation. So if you want to take a minute to find the Zoom window where our interpreter is doing her work, you can find it and pin it, and we appreciate your participation as well. I want to start with a few thank yous. First of all, to my campaign manager, Eli Stone, who is spending his birthday here as a part of this community conversation and was integral, obviously, in putting it all together. Thank you to you, Eli. Thank you to the many people who played a detailed role, giving significant time and effort to put together the public safety policy platform that I'm talking about tonight. I am proud of this document, but the last thing I want to do is pretend that it's just stuff that I came up with on my own. On the contrary, a number of Evanstonians with a diverse range of backgrounds and points of view and experiences gave a tremendous amount of time to help inform this, and I just cannot thank them enough for that effort. I want to say a big thank you to Molly Hartenstein, who's played a tremendous role in helping us put together these public conversations, who's spurred us to make sure that our campaign is engaging in public conversations about tough issues as much as possible. And most of our thanks to all of you for being a part of this. I am the part of a campaign that I love the most is these kind of conversations and the ability to go back and forth about tough issues, the flexibility of a little bit more time than you might have in a candidate forum with a 90-second timer going on to really get into some of the nuance. And so I appreciate you being a part of tonight, and I look forward to the discussion. So let me start with just a few kind of ground rules, essentially, about what we're doing and how. So first of all, again, we're here to discuss public safety policy for the city of Evanston. Recently, I put out a policy platform on this topic, which you can find on my website at danielbiss.com/public-safety, and it's also linked to in the chat. Obviously, I won't be reading it out loud, but we'll be hewing relatively closely to it. That discussion about these ideas will come at the beginning of this session, and then I want to open it up for a conversation. And so here's how I want to do that. I want to be as open as possible. We're not going to screen questions. We're not going to filter questions. We're not going to censor questions. So if you have a question that you want to ask yourself on screen, you can type the word question in the chat. If you instead have a question you want me to ask for you, you can type it itself into the chat, and we'll go through them in the order they're received to the extent that we have time. Now, I have one request. We're in a pandemic. We're all in front of our own computers. It's difficult to replace the feeling of us being in a room together, but I want us to do as much as we can to begin to emulate that. And so I would ask you to try to jump in to ask your question at the moment that something that someone else says spurs that thought you might have, or that suggestion, or that different point of view. You know, if everyone types question right now because you have something on your mind, then those questions that will be put in the queue before we even start the discussion will dominate the evening. And I want to make sure that you have the chance to interact with one another as well as just feeding questions toward me. So again, to put yourself in line to ask a question at any time tonight, either type the word question into the chat to get called on, or else type your question itself into the chat. And hopefully we can make this into the best facsimile of a conversation we would have if we were all together in a room somewhere. The last thing I'll say is I do want to keep the conversation focused on public safety. Obviously, I have a lot of respect for the numerous other priorities that folks have. And if you have questions that are off topic, you're welcome to put them in the chat and I'll make sure we follow up. But I know that a lot of folks came tonight specifically to talk about public safety policy. And so we just respectfully ask that you keep your questions on that topic and as concise as possible, so we leave as much room for everybody as we can. So with that, I want to move into the subject matter, and there's a lot to talk about. So let me kind of tell you how I think about this. I think we, as a country, are wrestling with questions of public safety policy, policing, racial justice, in a different way than we were before, prior to the vicious and unthinkable murder of George Floyd. And that has spurred an extraordinary movement and an extraordinary set of important conversations. And those conversations reverberate in every corner of this country, including in Evanston. But it's also the case, of course, that some people look at that and say, that heinous act is not something, thank God, that we see occurring in Evanston. And so how do we understand how to tailor a reaction to something that happened in Minneapolis and has not happened in Evanston to the situation we find ourselves in here? And I think it's important to say that, because obviously the perpetrator of that crime was someone with, a profoundly warped set of values and an ability to carry out an act that is unthinkable to most people. And we shouldn't pretend that that's the mentality of most Evanston police officers. We shouldn't pretend that, because in fact, we know that not to be the case through the course of our day-to-day lives here. But I think we also need to acknowledge that what occurred in that instance was an extreme endpoint of a philosophy and approach to public safety that has many, many, many other dangerous ramifications that do in fact come into play in every community of the country. And that's really where I think our conversation needs to focus. It is in fact the case that the history of policing in this country is inextricably tied to the effort to control Black and brown bodies, and specifically to protect white property. It's really been about, for much of our history at least, providing a sense of security for some as opposed to a sense of shared safety for all. And as we've seen the reaction both in our government programs and in our political rhetoric over the course of the last 50 and now even slightly more than 50 years to rising unease about crime, what we've seen is a tendency to continually respond to a problem of violence with more violence. And that is something that I don't think really matches the instincts that we bring to most of our lives. It's not how we try to interact in our own family lives. It's not how we interact in our professional contexts in most cases. And I think it's not the best point of view from which to deal with the question of crime control and public safety. And so the question that I think we get to ask ourselves in this moment is, how do we re-envision what it means to provide public safety for all without relying on the notion that the use of force needs to be the central tool that we deploy? In fact, let us reconceptualize what we do to say use of force is something that should be deployed in extreme, unusual circumstances. And there's lots and lots and lots of other safety-related problems that are solved in other ways. So that's the point of view that I bring to this topic. And let me now start by talking about some specific policies. The first thing I want to talk about is about the question of alternate first responder models, because it is the case that we have a number of situations when someone calls 911 or a first responder is summoned, and in many instances we send a police officer. And I think what we need to do is ask ourselves, of those circumstances, how often is it in fact the case that we need a police officer, and how often is it the case that we need somebody else? And so we need to start with a truly across the board audit of what all the police are involved in Evanston, ward by ward, street by street, problem by problem, and ask ourselves, of those circumstances, which are the ones that require someone able to deploy force, that require a police officer? And again, unfortunately, in my opinion, there are such circumstances. And for instance, there was a tragedy that occurred just last month in Evanston at the IHOP, where I think it was essential that we had Evanston police officers prepared to respond with the ability to use force. But I would argue there's also a lot of other situations where we currently deploy police where somebody else would be better positioned to address that problem. And an example that we talk about a lot in this country these days is dealing with mental health crises. Very often, the best way to address a mental health problem is not with an armed police officer, but with somebody trained to address mental health problems. The same is true of substance abuse problems. I would argue the same is true about crowd control at protests an awful lot of the time, or providing services to victims of violence and sexual assault, or for that matter, traffic stops. So there's a whole bunch of other areas that we currently deploy police to address where in fact someone else with a different type of training would be better positioned to address those problems. And then there's a third category of situations where you want to find some kind of co-response model where, for instance, perhaps there's a person dealing with a mental health crisis who is also at risk of hurting themselves or others. And you want to have a mental health professional and a police officer jointly come to address that problem. And so we need to divide the current police activity into these three categories. What's the stuff that police need to be doing? What's the stuff that somebody else could better do? And then what's the stuff that some kind of joint response is necessary? And then build up the capacity to provide those alternative responses. And this is a critical part of it. If we don't build up that capacity in terms of our ability to provide mental health services and substance abuse treatment and youth engagement services and more, then we're not able to actually make this maneuver. But once we've done that, then what needs to be done is we need to build a mechanism of routing of, for instance, our 911 services, so that when a call comes into 911, we have incredibly well-prepared, trained people with essentially a flow chart in front of them who can, based upon the values that our community has agreed upon in answering the previous question, say, okay, this is a call that needs to be routed to the police and a police officer needs to show up. But this other call is a call that needs to be routed to a mental health worker, and a mental health worker needs to show up, and so on and so forth. And so that is a difficult project. It's a technical project, and it requires real investment in the 911 dispatch system and the training and the continuous improvement over there, but it can be done. And there are in fact models in other communities that indicate that it can be done. So that's one, I think, central component of what we need to accomplish. I think there are important policy changes that need to be made inside of the Evanston Police Department, certainly around transparency about priorities, publishing ward-specific data about how and where police spend their time, around questions of privacy. The Evanston Police are in the process of acquiring a drone, and their automatic license plate reader technology is used as well. We need to have very, very tight control on the utilization of technology to surveil Evanston residents by the Evanston Police Department. We ought to stop purchasing surplus military equipment as well. I think we need to move away from a kind of military thinking about public safety in this country. And I think we also need to do everything we can, and there's been progress made in this front, but more needs to be done to ensure that as many of our police officers as possible are themselves Evanston residents who are in the community and know the community and are accountable to the community as well. The next area I want to talk about is accountability and oversight. And this is obviously critical. I just want to start from the beginning here. A police officer is a very special type of city worker. There is no other city worker who shows up to solve a problem with a gun, who shows up to solve a problem with a badge, with the power to place you under arrest and put you in a cage. That is a special and extraordinary set of powers that we give our police officers. With that form of power needs to come a special level of accountability, of course. And I think that the most fundamental step that we ought to take in that direction is around the Citizen Police Review Commission, which needs to be remade so that it has significantly more teeth, the ability to open investigations and issue subpoenas, the ability to discipline and if need be remove officers. It also needs to be truly independent. The people on this commission shouldn't themselves be in law enforcement or have immediate family who are in law enforcement. We need to ensure that with the awesome power that is given to police officers comes a form of accountability that is not about police overseeing themselves, but true external resident body overseeing police. We need to improve the way that we do use of force reporting, including the definitions, which are a little bit lax. Pulling a gun, in my book, is a use of force, but it's not actually a type of use of force that triggers reporting in the Evanston Police Department. And so we need to make sure that our definitions are appropriate and that we're being as transparent as possible, both in response to Freedom of Information Act requests, but also just proactively. We need to do everything we can to put that data out there. And on this point, I think I think here's a critical aspect of this topic. There, at the core of this question that we're asking ourselves tonight, is a trust challenge, a challenge of trust between parts of our community, especially Black and Brown Evanstonians, and the police department. And if we want to repair the trust problem, what we have to do is act as though we, the city government, are true partners with the community in the act of providing public safety for all and in the act of ensuring accountability. So let me give you an example. We have legislation that we passed in Springfield that requires the collection by police departments of traffic stop data that is disaggregated by race. So we can know if there's racial bias in terms of the traffic stops that occur in the city. There's similar data around stops of pedestrians, which, by the way, shows enormous racial gaps between how often Black and white Evanstonians are stopped on the street by police officers. There's similar data around use of force. And we shouldn't quietly, reluctantly release the data because we have to. We should proudly release the data as part of a community conversation and utilize that annual release of data as an opportunity to bring in the community, bring in stakeholders, bring in law enforcement, sit together at a table and say, what happened last year? Was it an improvement? If so, that's phenomenal. What did we do right to move in that direction? And how can we do even more of it next year? Was it a step in the wrong direction? And gosh, I hope that's not the case. But if it was, let's think hard about what caused that to be. Does it match our instincts? And to the extent it doesn't match our instincts, what's that disconnect coming from? These conversations that are held with all the relevant stakeholders at the table because the city wants everyone in the door analyzing that data and helping make things better can not only help make things better, but fundamentally change that equation of trust. Next, I want to talk about youth, because youth services and policing are kind of opposite attitudes to related problems. And our goal needs to be to deflect youth away from police contact and arrest whenever possible. I mean, this is about ensuring that we don't create arrest records that can be dangerous for subsequent school and employment. It's about the very significant data that we see about the impact of even a very brief point of contact between young people, particularly young people of color, and the criminal justice system and their long-term life path and employability. And so that needs to be the goal that we bring to that. The Youth and Young Adult Division in the city has done really important work at connecting youth and engaging youth who are disconnected from aspects of our community. And I think we need to beef up that work and deepen that work and expand funding for the Youth and Young Adult Division as well. We need to remove curfew laws, which are fundamentally ineffective at what they're supposed to do, which is to provide public safety, and they're damaging to relationships between youth of color and police. And finally, we need to end contact between school resource officers and students. And this is another example of how I'm not talking about bad people doing their job poorly. I'm talking about good people in a bad system that needs to be reformed. Because there's no question that in District 202, the feedback that we hear about the quality of the two school resource officers and ETHS is positive feedback. But the question is that the kind of experience that we want to expose a high school student at Evanston to? Do we want high school students in Evanston who have been traumatized by bad experiences to be exposed to an armed, uniformed police officer in school? Do we want to have someone on campus to make dealing with disciplinary problems, transforming, I should say, disciplinary problems into criminal issues easier than it should be? And fundamentally, I think the answer to those questions is no. I want to end by talking about human services, because as I said in the beginning, if we truly want to reorient our approach to providing for shared safety away from the use of force and away from a traditional vision of policing towards something else, what that something else is the provision of human services, whether that be mental health services, substance abuse treatment, housing services, supportive housing and employment supports as well. These are the kinds of services that, as we have over the course of generations moved toward mass incarceration and other harsh approaches to the question of public safety, these are the things that have been defunded because there's been no money left over for these services. And so we need to make sure that we're expanding the availability of mental health services. We need to become a trauma-informed city, and we need to lift restrictions that make it difficult for Evanstonians who are returning from the criminal justice system to find housing and employment. And there are good ordinances on the books in Cook County on this front, but they're only enforced sporadically. And so there's plenty that the city of Evanston can do to ensure that we are providing opportunities needed by returning Evanstonians, so that we don't, by virtue of our own policies, continue to create a cycle where people revolve in and out of our criminal justice system. And so that's, kind of a quick tour of a lot of the things that are on my mind. And obviously, I want to end by saying I said a lot. It's only a portion of what's in the document that I hope you'll look at if you feel like you want more detail. I'm also not naive. I understand that we're going to have challenges in enacting part of this vision. It's going to require a significant amount of work to bring the community together and get people comfortable to this very different vision of what it means to provide for public safety. I also know that when I give you a laundry list of here's 25 things that I want to do, we're only going to be able to do some of them at a time. So this is going to be a long-term project. If I'm lucky enough to be elected mayor, I'll be mayor for at least 4 years, perhaps more. And this will be a project that will be high on the list of priorities, if not at the very top on the list of priorities throughout that time, because the kind of fundamental change that we are looking to make is one that will require all hands on deck, a tremendous amount of collaboration, and a tremendous amount of persistence over the course of time. So with that, thank you for your patience. And I want to start the questions. It looks like folks are typing questions into the chat. So I will I'll read your name and question. And if anybody if anyone who's asked a question doesn't want their name read, if you could just inform that in the chat as well, so that I don't want to read anyone's name who doesn't want their name to be read. But the first person is Julianne Lloyd, who asks, maybe bystander intervention training can be happening on a community level as well. Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly right on a couple different levels. First of all, specifically because of what it achieves, the goal of empowering residents to intervene as needed, to act as an accountability measure and to provide for the safety of our fellow residents, but also because of the signal it sends that we are all going to need to step up to the plate to solve these problems together. This is not going to be something that is done for us by a mayor and 9 folks in the city council. It's going to be something that we're going to have to do collectively, and that means residents being at the table to shape the vision and design the policies. And frankly, as you say, Julianne, residents being at the table to change the environment as well, and to play their own role in enhancing the accountability mechanisms for provision of public safety in town. So thank you for that. And so Betsy asks Betsy Wilson asks a related question. Can we implement restorative and transformative justice work so that neighbors can talk to each other rather than calling the police? Yes, and I think there's a direct relationship here that if you look at the most policed neighborhoods of Evanston and in most other cities, those are also the neighborhoods that have been victims of disinvestment from the public sector in all other respects, right? So if you say, for instance, in Evanston, if you say, listen, we're not going to put a school in the 5th Ward, but we'll put a lot of cops in the 5th Ward, you're sending a very clear signal about what the problem-solving approach in the 5th Ward ought to be. It's not about community coming together. It's not about neighbors talking to neighbors and solving problems collectively in, as you put it, Betsy, a restorative fashion. It's about the use of force, or at least the capability to deploy force, being imposed upon the neighborhood as a tool to provide for public safety. That again, my fundamental point of view here is that needs to be the last resort, not the primary tool used to provide for safety. And the primary tool, and I think your question is very well put, because I talked a lot about the human services that government needs to provide, but that even sits on top of the real underlying tool, which is a strong community where people have tools and training to support one another through traumatic events and difficult events, and seek out restorative solutions, rather than just feel like, yikes, something bad is happening and all I can do is call the police and ask them to help. So I strongly agree with the vision behind that question. I think it's really critical, and I think you're sort of challenging me in a really, really good way, that as we move our attitude from, we, the government, are going to use this special collection of people with extraordinarily special powers and they're going to fix our safety problem for us, to we have to collectively, in a humanistic and restorative way, solve our safety problem, that naturally creates a different level of role for the resident participant. And I think that's an important thing for me to always keep in mind. So thank you for that. Evangeline Seamark says, if elected, how will you ensure that Evanston survivors of violence are at the table when issues of public safety are being discussed? So first of all, I think it's appropriate to name the fact that Evangeline lost her son to gun violence. And I appreciate your willingness to be a part of this conversation and to advocate for survivors, and to have responded to that unimaginable trauma by participating in so many civic activities to reframe the way that we think about public safety. So I just wanted to honor your experiences and your trauma, and thank you for the extraordinary work that you do. I think that we can't make good policies if we don't have a good definition of who needs to be at the table, because what goes wrong is not so much that the technical part of implementation gets messed up. What goes wrong is that the people being listened to don't fully reflect who needs to have who has concerns and considerations that need to be taken into account. And so I think that if we are going to sit down and go through any of the processes I talked about earlier tonight, like, for example, if we're going to sit down and say, okay, here's a census of what all the police are doing, and let's ask ourselves how much of that could better be done by somebody else. The question of who sits at the table to answer that question it's just fundamental. And if we don't have survivor voices at that table, we're going to get the wrong answer. I can guarantee you we're going to get the wrong answer. And so that table needs to not only be racially diverse, it needs to be experientially diverse, it needs to have age diversity, it needs to have professional diversity, it needs to have socioeconomic diversity. And I think that survivors have I think it's very important not to expect that survivors have a responsibility to us, right? We have a responsibility to them. But when survivors are willing to participate in these kinds of processes and educate us, we're just fools if we don't include them. And that's a value that I would bring to this at all times. So thank you for the question. Sue Calder asks, there has been much discussion about who should respond to FOIA requests. Should the police department answer FOIA requests that involve the police department, or should they be responded to by the city clerk's office? I believe they should be responded to by the city clerk's office. I think that you might ask yourself, why do we have an independently elected clerk, right? Much of what the clerk does is sort of ministerial or mechanical. And so Usually if you have a separately elected official, it's because they are supposed to be a check and a balance on somebody else. Well, the aspect of the clerk's traditional duties that are most directly a check or a balance on the other elected officials is responding to FOIA. And so, I don't know that an elected official personally should be responding. I think professional staff are best equipped to do that so as to avoid politicizing FOIA. But I believe that staff ought to be in the clerk's office, certainly not inside EPD to respond to FOIA requests about EPD, and not in the city corporation counsel's office to respond to FOIA requests about city government, because you need some independence. So that's the answer, Sue, to your narrow question. I appreciate the question a great deal. I also want to say one other thing. The city's attitude toward Freedom of Information Act requests and toward transparency more broadly needs to be positive. The city shouldn't see itself as defensive of requests for information from residents. If you're a lawyer advising a client and you get a letter saying, "Tell me all this," your natural reaction as a lawyer is to say, "Okay, client, here's what you absolutely have to disclose, and there's all this other stuff that I can help you get away with not disclosing." That's kind of what lawyers are trained to do, and they do it well. But the city government shouldn't have that attitude. Our attitude shouldn't be, how can we figure out how little to disclose? Our attitude should be, our residents are our partners in solving problems. By the way, they're also our bosses to the extent that we're elected officials. And so we should proactively disclose as much information as we can, subject to privacy and safety constraints. And of course, there are privacy and safety constraints, but they're relatively limited. And I think if the city did a better job of making more, I talked about earlier, making more police data in particular available, but just making more data in general available in a way that's digestible, creating, dashboards that allow residents to track progress on important metrics that we care about. I think if we had that institutionalized as a matter of course, again, we'd get a better product. We'd get better government because the residents would be more engaged in holding us accountable and in knowing exactly what we're doing, and things would improve for that reason. But additionally, we would get a much higher level of trust between residents and government, and that's equally important as well. So Carolyn Laughlin, mincing no words, asks, "We've heard that police unions can be a significant barrier to reform. How problematic will the Evanston Police Department union be as we attempt to implement these plans?" Well, it is certainly the case that across the country, police unions have been barriers to reforms. And for instance, just 2 weeks ago now, I guess, in Springfield, the legislature passed landmark and important criminal justice reform legislation, among other things, getting rid of cash bail, which was a really, really important thing. And the law enforcement organizations, both management and labor, were strongly opposed. And so we have seen strong resistance across the country. I will say that if I'm elected mayor, I will negotiate in good faith with the Fraternal Order of Police local, and I'll push for what I need to push for. And I think that we're in a situation where the residents support bold, true reform in our police department. And so, I will listen and be respectful, but I'm also prepared to be tough and take a hard line. And I would say that some things that need to be addressed are in that contract, or in the contract that the FOP signs with the city. And when that's going to be renegotiated next year, there are changes that I would like to see, particularly around what occurs with disciplinary actions and representation of officers who've been accused of malfeasance in the disciplinary process. So there are changes to the contract, and I'll sit at the table and be a tough negotiator and do my best to get a good outcome for the city. But a lot of the stuff we're talking about, in fact, the clear majority of what we're talking about is not in the FOP contract. And so I would just say, we'll work with them whenever possible. We'll negotiate in good faith. We'll have areas of agreement. We'll have areas of strong disagreement. I'm going to keep pushing through those areas of disagreement. And we also need to be cognizant of the fact that all this work ultimately is implemented by the folks in the police department. And so designing a process where they're at the table and understand what we're trying to accomplish is going to be necessary to actually get something done that takes hold. Because you can write all the words you want to write on a piece of paper. If they're not implemented in practice by the folks who are doing the work, then we haven't made much progress. So I come into this question clear-eyed, Sue, and having studied the way in which police unions have obstructed progress in other parts of the country, and you know, ready to react appropriately if that's how this goes, and also ready to not assume anything and see if we can have a different outcome as well. David Melton says, can you provide an overview of how complaints against police are investigated and resolved in Evanston? And yeah, I mean, that's a really core issue here, right? So I talked earlier about my interest in really remaking and significantly beefing up the Citizen Police Review Commission. We have a Citizen Police Review Commission today. It exists, but it has very little power, really. It doesn't have the power to itself initiate investigations or issue subpoenas, and it can't itself discipline officers. And so they can go through the process of conducting an investigation and making a recommendation, but ultimately the teeth, the power rests inside the police department, and it really is the police department that's overseeing itself. And of course, there have been positive instances, for instance, under Chief Cook, of officers being disciplined when they behave in inappropriate ways. But I think we can all, well, I personally believe that we're not going to solve this problem by asking police to be the oversight mechanism for police. I think it's just not where the solution lies. There's inherent conflicts of interest. There's inherent solidarity that exists inside police departments. It's just not the right way forward. And so I think if we really want to restore trust between police and the community, we need to have an oversight mechanism with real teeth and real power that is completely independent of the police department. I should say, I should give the Citizens Network of Protection, which is an Evanston organization that works specifically on these issues, a lot of credit for pushing hard for an approach. They actually believe that the commission should be elected. There should be 9 members of this commission, 1 elected from each of the city wards. My preference at this point would be a mix of elected and appointed folks, but I think what's critical is that we have a commission with genuine independence and real power. And if you do that, and they take their work seriously and do it well, then you start to have an ability to go to the community and say, there's actually accountability, and it's external and something that can be counted upon. Julianne Lloyd asks, what do we do in the meantime while we work on this great reform? I know a lot of people are wondering if we are harming others greatly by calling police for safety reasons. This is a really great question. I flagged that these are not quick, right? We're not going to be done in 5 minutes or 5 weeks or 5 months or it may take 5 years. And in the meantime, there are people suffering. There are people suffering from racial injustice and the way in which policing occurs. And there are people suffering from the trauma associated with experiences they've already had. And so what to do in the meantime? And I think Betsy's question about pursuing restorative approaches is an important one. I think that we need to pursue restorative approaches to the problems that we see in our own communities to the extent possible. I also know that it's impossible to avoid calling the police sometimes, depending upon what kind of a situation of urgent physical danger that a person may find themselves in. And so, there is not a simple, easy answer to this, and we're going to have to undergo gradual evolution from a system that is causing people trauma, and that's itself an insufficient, inadequate answer, because you're telling people that some of that trauma will continue. But we have to, in the meantime, do all we can to repair that harm and to find alternate models that we can implement in our own neighborhoods and communities to provide for public safety in a different way. Gus Gonzalez asks to be called on. Gus, do you mind unmuting yourself? Are you there, Gus?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Thanks so much.
All right. Yeah, my question's pretty simple. Hi, been a while, but essentially, in full disclosure, I live in Chicago, but I'm supporting you. But really, it comes down to the concept of with issues with the police in particular, things like wrongful death, corruption, that stuff. Essentially, from my own analysis, I'm not an expert, but I always figured if there was some kind of insurance policy that basically the first responders, police in particular, would have to have. That way, if there is your wrongful deaths, your shootings that were deemed unnecessary, corruption, stuff like that, any and all civil issues besides criminal stuff would be paid out of the police, that insurance fund's pocket, instead of the taxpayers. And maybe that would also transition into better training or better dealing with the public. I figure it's the same principle that federally the banks have. There's the Federal Insurance Corporation. If you rob a bank, the feds come in. But it's the same process. And maybe that, from my own analysis, that would probably help in reducing a lot of wrongful deaths and a lot of issues between police and the everyday citizenry. Just what's your opinion?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Gus. I mean, the system that we have now, and I appreciate you acknowledging that you're from Chicago, and the amount of money that the city of Chicago has spent, it's, I forget what, $500 million or more in the
Yeah, a
last
little over,
decade.
give or take.
Yeah, has spent in these payouts as a result of police misconduct. It's an outrageous, I mean, to use kind of a not very emotionally, satisfying word, it's an outrageous misalignment of incentives, right? What it says is that police misconduct that causes terrible pain and then terrible fiscal costs just gets put on the city's general funds budget and doesn't really affect the police departments themselves. And I do think that if you could change that up in some way so that the payment of that was felt in some way by the police department, you would change the incentives, and you would change the motivations to have a different type of trauma-informed trainings, and training that is truly deep in terms of the way it addresses questions of systemic racism as well as unconscious bias. And I think if you could find a structure like this that worked without just taking out an insurance policy and then some other third party pays, and that still doesn't have any consequences that change the incentives.
Well, you figure it'd be a step in the right direction, because trust me, if the police themselves, and they could start out as a small pro, maybe if it's successful enough, go countywide or statewide. But I figure if you have something like that, it would force them to go, okay, we have to kind of, at least the police union's minimum can't be unconditionally defending every single cop, because as the son of retired law enforcement, I can tell you, even he'll say not all cops are good, but at least that is as sort of a start, because that always scares the hell out of somebody when,
Yeah, I hear you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Gus. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Michael says that he has called and emailed and used the 311 platform and had trouble finding a Latinx liaison, or perhaps even I'm not sure, but maybe he's suggesting that he's having trouble finding 311 call operators who are able to speak in Spanish. I think the city needs to do a better job with language access. There's no question. And we need to do a better job of translating materials on our website, especially into Spanish, which is of course the most common non-English language in the city, but to the extent necessary into other languages as well, and also certainly for our responders, whether those are the folks taking 311 or 911 calls or other service providers in town. I think we're beginning to see a growing political power in the Latinx community in Evanston. Thank God. I think it's belated, but it's really, really important. There are Latinx candidates running for city clerk and for aldermen in several wards, not to mention, of course, on the city council. And I think that the problem of language access in this community is real, and something I'm committed to tackling as mayor. Joan Rothenberg makes a really important point that I think we ought to name. She says she doesn't see any of her Black friends on this Zoom. And I'll be honest, I cannot tell you how many nearly segregated audiences I've spoken to in this town. I'm speaking tonight. I'm not looking at the chat, so I don't know who all is here, but I'm gathering from Joan's question that that there's a big white majority in the crowd tonight. I was speaking to a group this afternoon that was 100% African American, and I find myself speaking to a lot of segregated groups in this town, and I think we love to talk about how we value our diversity, but we have very segregated diversity in Evanston, and I think it's a severe problem. I think it's a severe problem in terms of our residential segregation, and I think it's, as Joan's example of tonight points out, it's a severe problem in terms of our kind of cultural segregation and our just networks that only barely overlap. And so obviously a mayor has the responsibility to reach out in all communities. That I would hope is a given, but I think the mayor also has an opportunity to start to bring people together, to tear down some of the walls that have preserved segregation in this community for so long, to change our housing policies and to change some of the programmatic offerings of the city to try to create actual integration, not just segregated diversity, because integration, I think, is really necessary if we also want to have justice. Cynthia Dvorak says, and I mentioned that you mentioned that the actions of the police department should be guided by the values established by the Evanston community. How do you envision community and government interacting and determining those values? Yeah, I mean, this is honestly, I think that so much of the ballgame lies in this question, that we need to have processes where the whole community comes to the table and has their voices heard when we are at the stage of formulating options for consideration, not when we're at the stage of finalizing votes. We are blessed in Evanston. There are an extraordinary number of active, engaged people who know how to make their voices heard. There's also a lot of people whose voices aren't being heard. And I think it's very easy in a community this engaged for the government to say, well, I'm hearing so much from so many people that I must be hearing everything I need to hear. And that's not happening right now in Evanston. And so if we're going to actually fundamentally rethink our public safety policies, we need to go into every corner of the community and ensure, not provide the opportunity, right? Not have the town hall in a neighborhood where you haven't had a lot of input, and then because not enough people show up, walk away and say, I guess that community doesn't care. But instead, do the work required to recruit representative people from across the city, from a broad variety of different backgrounds and points of view to be at the process. I'll give you one concrete example. There is now a growing movement across the country of essentially what's called compensated public input. And the idea here is that it's like really normal and traditional for cities to hire an expensive consultant and have that consultant do a public engagement process. And so you're paying some white guy in a suit to manage a process and then have volunteers from across the community actually give the input. Well, that means that the volunteers from across the community probably aren't people who can't participate without childcare, probably aren't people who work 3 different part-time jobs and can't give up a shift and still continue to pay rent by taking an evening to be a part of the process. It means that community groups that work with disenfranchised and ignored communities every day of the week aren't being supported. And so instead of using that money to hire the consultant, use the funds to actually compensate people who are involved in the public engagement process themselves, and therefore get a far more representative swath of the community. So that's one concrete example of a way to get at it. But fundamentally, we need to be incredibly deliberate about who we invite to the table and how we invite them to the table, and when we decide that the table is properly populated so that we can move forward, and when, on the other hand, we say, this group isn't enough, and we can't start moving forward with this group because we'll get the wrong answers if we do. So that's to me the value system I bring to this. And that, I want to stress that last thing, because I think a lot of times policymakers will say, we need to get a group at the table that is going to enable us to sell the policy. And that's true, obviously. But we also need a group at the table that's going to enable us to make the policy. And we need to design the public input to ensure not just that it's going to give us the political capital to pass a thing, but it's going to give us the reach into all of the community needed to ensure that we're trying to pass the right thing. Peter asks, to the extent not already covered, how will you approach the city's relationship with Northwestern? I'll give a quick reply, but I do want to focus primarily on public safety questions, and obviously there's a public safety dimension to that question, but I think I don't want to assume that Peter is only asking it from that point of view, because there's a lot of other dimensions too. I believe that the city and the university need each other, that the city's vibrancy is enhanced by having a university like Northwestern in it, and that Northwestern cannot possibly thrive without a thriving Evanston. But that we need to do a better job of renegotiating the terms of our agreements with the university. There are a lot of private universities in other parts of the country that are, though they usually don't make traditional property tax payments, they typically make more generous payments in lieu of taxes, or pilots as they're called, to the city that they're in. And I think that Northwestern, in light of the fact both that it needs Evanston to thrive in order for it to be an attractive place, that it's going to be able to draw students and faculty too, but also because they need things from us on an ongoing basis, whether that be zoning changes or permitting, especially kind of ambitious permitting requests they sometimes have around public events. There is an opportunity for us to sit at the table with Northwestern and say, listen, we want you to succeed. We need you to succeed. We're prepared to talk about your priorities, but we have priorities as well, and we have needs as well. And our city cannot thrive if you don't step up to the plate and do a better job. I also want to add to this point, and kind of migrating into the public safety dimension specifically of the question. The relationship between the city and the university has frayed in the last, God help me with the subtraction, 4 or 5 months, I suppose, as the cops out of the NUPD, the anti-NUPD student movement grew, resulting in protests that the city of Evanston reacted to with police response, and also by bringing in officers from other jurisdictions, which cost the city money, and the city wanted Northwestern to pay, and it's not clear if Northwestern is going to. Just to back up from all that stuff, I want to start by saying that, with all due respect, the Northwestern administration did not handle that situation well. And I believe that they behaved in a way that could have had no possible outcome except for to inflame the protests, and to they treated the protesters in a way that I believe was disrespectful, that was not respectful of the legitimacy of their demands, even if the administration wasn't going to meet their demands. And then that created an outcome that resulted in an escalation of the challenge. And of course, now the city was on the hook to pay costs associated with that escalation. So I think a different kind of partnership with the Northwestern administration when situations like that arise, so that we can handle challenges in a way that's more sensitive and respectful and appropriate, and doesn't escalate problems, but actually de-escalates them, will be critical. And we're going to have a new mayor in a few months. Hope it's me. It might be somebody else, but it'll be a new mayor. And there's going to be a new president of Northwestern University before too long as well. That's an opportunity to reset the relationship. And I think that that reset could be beneficial to the city and the university. Chris O'Connell writes, how can the community be more helpful with diffusing mental illness problems? Great question. Part of it, one thing that I think we all need to work on, I know I need to work on it, but I think all of us would benefit from working on, is the continued destigmatization of mental illness. I think that as much progress as we've made here in February of 2021, we still have a long way to go. And the stigma around mental illness makes it difficult for people to seek help, makes people uncomfortable talking to one another about these challenges, and results in a kind of festering and metastasization of mental health challenges. So that's something that I think we all can do every single day. I think that we need to support the robust provision of mental health services. I mean, we passed a law in the state legislature in like 2011 or something, creating mental health parity in the state of Illinois. Do we actually believe that access to mental health is truly universally available in this state or in this city? God knows it's not. And so we need to advocate for a significant expansion of mental health services, and to make sure that we understand that it's a human right to have access to healthcare, and mental health care is a component of healthcare just like any other. And by the way, it's also beneficial to the city, even from a financial standpoint, to provide these services on the front end, as opposed to just allowing the problems to get worse and worse and worse and eventually more expensive. So we have a lot to do here, and I think a lot that we can do. Sue Paston asks, what about tapping into students at ETHS and broadening public engagement and Fleetwood Jourdain and Black Lives Matter and Latinx groups and AAPI groups and more? Yeah, yes. And I think it's really, it is really a gift that we live in a community with so many engaged people and organizations. There is a profound level of civic connection in town at the various institutions you allude to and more. And so we have a huge opportunity to get a lot of input, and we have to grab hold of every one of those opportunities. But I do want to reiterate that when we've finished taking input from every organized group in town, we will have a giant stack of useful input, and we will appreciate that and use it and respect it and honor it and listen to it, and we will still have left a lot of people out of the discussion. And so I think the reliance on these wonderful organizations to speak for everyone, instead of an acknowledgement that they speak incredibly effectively for some, is a trap that I'm really committed to avoid falling into. And then Dana Pearl asks, what input did I get from which parts of the community to create my public safety platform? I have much to, poor Eli, my campaign manager's consternation. I've spent a tremendous amount of time during the course of the last months during this campaign studying this question and getting input from all different corners of the community, putting together working groups to help me think about this question and teach me, and just talking with people. And that was talking to people in the Black community who themselves have been victims of inequitable behavior and sometimes even violent behavior by the police. It's talking to people in our schools. It's talking to youth organizers. It's talking to educators. It's talking to law enforcement professionals as well. It's talking to academic experts who study this stuff, and it's talking to people who've lived in Evanston for many, many decades, and maybe even their families have been in Evanston for many generations, and hearing about the evolution that they've seen and felt on this topic. And so I don't want to pretend for 1 second that I've done all the listening I need to do, or all the learning that I have a responsibility to do, or that I've heard every voice that needs to be heard. But I do feel unbelievably appreciative of the many people who have given a lot of time to help me on this journey. And I'm excited to continue learning and listening and broadening the collection and palette of voices in this discussion. And on that point, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this discussion tonight. I'm going to open the chat for the first time and just see that there's 52 messages in there, and I know I've not answered 52 questions. And so um, I, I apologize if I didn't get to your question. Please send me an email at daniel@danielbiss.com if you have further questions. I guarantee you that this will not be the last conversation like this that we have, because I know that if I have a responsibility to the community to have those conversations, and also I cannot possibly find the right answers without continuing to have these conversations. Next week, actually a week from today, on the 10th at 6 o'clock, we're having a conversation just like this one on the equity and transparency policy platform that we put out. So I would be thrilled for you to sign up to that as well. And I don't know if anyone can put the link to that in the chat before we close, but we would love to have your input there. We would love to have your continued conversation. And I just can't thank you enough. Running for office is a funny thing to do. It's complicated and it's strange, and sometimes it's inspiring, and sometimes it's dull, and sometimes it's uplifting, and sometimes it's disheartening. But the ability to sit with this extraordinary group of people and talk through these questions and hear these really, really good, thoughtful, difficult questions from people who I know I can count on to challenge me and push me really hard, not only for the next 20 days until the election, but for the 4 years after that. It just gives me such hope for what we can accomplish in this city. So thank you to all of you. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your willingness to push me and your continued willingness to push me hard. And thank you for being willing partners in our effort to make this community better. I know we can do it. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.